in Matthew, it's, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," talking not to Jesus now, but talking to the crowds or to John the Baptist. And in Luke's Gospel, the voice says, "You are my beloved Son, today, you are my Son, today I have begotten you." And so you've got three different accounts. Some early Christians reconciled this by saying that what happened is when Jesus got baptized, the voice came three different times and said all three different things.
But okay, so let's go with the first two are close enough to for jazz, right? The third one's a little different. So how do we? Is it where is the four different people standing on four different street corners watching the same accident, writing down the witness report, different theory? Where is that with you?
Yeah, so there's obviously something to that. Whenever you have eyewitness accounts of something, they differ from one another. But the thing about eyewitness accounts is if you're in a court of law and you're taking eyewitness accounts, you want to know what really happened. And if you have eyewitness accounts that disagree with each other, then the fact they're eyewitnesses doesn't help you very much because they disagree. And so you have to figure out what exactly happened. And so with the Gospels of the New Testament, you're in a kind of a similar situation. You've got different people. In this case, you're not dealing with eyewitnesses. You're dealing with later Christians who are telling the stories. But they tell the stories differently. So there are actually two tasks, I think, that the reader has. One is there some way to get behind the differences to figure out what really happened, was one question. And the second question is, given the fact that these storytellers are telling their accounts differently, isn't it important to know what each author is trying to emphasize? And rather than trying to reconcile the different accounts, let each account speak for itself because each author is trying to stress something. And you miss what this author is trying to stress if, in fact, you say that he's saying the same thing as somebody else, because then you're missing the points of his story.
Well, and although we've been talking about the New Testament discrepancies for Christians, really that idea of these different versions is kind of a long-standing biblical tradition. There's lots of different stories starting from the very beginning of the Bible.
Absolutely, and the problems are even worse when you get to the Old Testament for lots of reasons. I mean, you mentioned the two different creation stories. There's a creation story in chapter 1 of Genesis and a different one in chapter 2 of Genesis, and they are very different from each other to the point of having discrepancies between them. And in fact, the Hebrew Bible is just chock full of discrepancies that when you point them out to somebody, they're quite shocking because there's a sort of thing where if you just read through the Bible, you may not notice them, but once somebody starts pointing them out to you, you think, "Wow, how could that? How did I miss that?" But
right.
But they're certainly there.
Well, and there's whole different versions of even things which people generally don't even think of, like the Exodus story. There are big, significant differences in some of the ways in which that story gets told, or the fact that there's two different lists of the so-called Ten Commandments.
Yes, I know. In fact, it's very hard to figure out what the Ten Commandments are because there are different ways. Protestants and Catholics and Jews actually all have 10 Commandments, but they're organized differently. So there are these striking differences in the Hebrew Bible, and one of the explanations for it usually is that there different parts of the Hebrew Bible came from different sources, and these different sources had different points of view.
And not surprising, some of the versions of the biblical stories that we know that appear in the Quran are different still. And it's the same.
What's going on is that all of these stories are being passed on, both in written form but also in oral traditions. And anybody who's worked with oral traditions knows that things change when people tell stories. They can change overnight as people pass on stories. And with the case of the Hebrew Bible, we're dealing with stories that were passed on by word of mouth for centuries. And so obviously there are going to be lots and lots of changes in the stories depending on who's hearing them.
And is that the basis for so much of the I guess the miscommunication of misquoting Jesus?
Well, misquoting Jesus is dealing with this phenomenon in a kind of a written form. So the question there is, once these texts get written down, so you get Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you get these written, the letters of Paul. How do the words come down to us? Well, they come down to us by scribes copying the words that were available to them. And what happens in the oral tradition, as things get changed, continues on in the written tradition, so that the stories change even as scribes copy their texts. The problem is we don't have the original copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or Paul, or any of the books from the ancient world. We have much later copies. For the New Testament, most of our copies are centuries after the originals, and all of these copies have differences in them. They don't agree with one another in their wording because scribes have changed the wording, and so the task is to figure out what was the original copy of Mark, what did it look like, and why was it changed?
Well, give us an example then of, because that book was surprisingly controversial, I thought, for what you were really trying to make was a basic, really simple, again, commonly accepted point within some circles, that it's, that we humans create a game of telephone by translating, mistranslating, these passages, sometimes with the best of intent and sometimes not.
Right. There are some very big differences among our manuscripts, our surviving handwritten copies of the New Testament. As one key example, one of the favorite stories of people reading the New Testament Gospels is the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, where this woman is caught in the act of adultery and they drag her before Jesus and they say that the law says we're supposed to stone a person like this to death. What do you say? And Jesus gets out of this trap. I mean, it's a trap because if he says, well, yeah, go ahead and stone her, then he's violating his own teachings of law and mercy, of love and mercy. But if he says, no, forgive her, then he's breaking the law of Moses. And so either way, he's condemned. And so he stoops up to the ground and he starts writing on the ground. And then he looks up and he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. And this does the trick. Everybody leaves because everybody has sinned. And so there's no one left, just the woman. And Jesus says, has no one condemned you? She says, no, Lord, no one. And he says, well, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So this is a beautiful story. It's in all the Hollywood movies about Jesus, probably the most beloved story of the Gospels altogether. But the problem is it wasn't originally in the Gospels. The story occurs only in the Gospel of John, and as it turns out, it's not in any of our oldest or best manuscripts of the Gospel of John. So it appears to have been a story that was floating around that some scribe put into a margin maybe of a manuscript, and eventually it crept into the manuscripts that got copied for the English editions of the New Testament, but it wasn't originally part of the New Testament.
And we don't know who that scribe is. We don't know what... we don't know where that scribe was, that story was preserved. And that's key. A lot of the stories, especially something like in the Gospel of John, there's a definite sort of flavor of the geography of that area that ends up in that gospel.
Right, and this story, among the problems are that it's not just that it's not found in the manuscripts, but the style of writing is different in the story. It uses words that don't occur anywhere else in the Gospel of John. So it's actually a story that's alien to the Gospel of John. You don't notice that so much when you read it in English because it all sounds kind of the same, but when you read it in Greek, it's a very different feel to it, and that's more evidence that somebody, someplace, at some time inserted the story into the Gospel of John. So then one question Christians have, of course, is should this be considered part of the Bible or not? I mean, it's in the English Bible, but
right.
Is it originally part? Well,
okay, so that brings us to the English Bible. I know later on when I get email, I'll get a couple dozen from some very sincere people who will say, your guest is totally wrong and you're full of it. All you need is the King James Version of the Bible, and that settles it. That is the inspired Word of God, the King James Version of the Bible. I want to ask Dr. Bart Ehrman about that coming up next. We're talking about the book Jesus Interrupted and his other book, too,